Record.
Yeah. Dear loving Father in heaven, thank you for your unfathomable love. Lord, shower your wisdom to conduct this webinar successfully. We thank you for the resource person and the topic of the talk, which is unique and intriguing. Bless all who join with us and may their purpose be fulfilled. This we ask in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
There is little in life so reassuring as a genuine welcome. I invite Dr. G. Patricia Alfenilla, Head and Assistant Professor, Department of English, JAC, to welcome the gathering.
Distinguished professors, respected sisters, learned faculties, and aspiring scholars, my dear colleagues of our institution, present virtual greetings to all. This is a part of a series of online webinars in connection with the Golden Jubilee of the Department of English. The webinars aim at providing key inputs to the review of literature at the high-level literary analysis on sustainable development for higher education, especially in English literature. Today is an auspicious day, but also a gifted day to have the phenomenal professor of all the times who will always inspire us to take up in teaching. Professor Joseph Dorairaj is undoubtedly one of the most brilliant minds to have ever walked the earth. And the time available to me is limited since we are overwhelmed by the 455 responses for participation in today's webinar. Every moment of my talk may curtail in getting the firing ideas of the great speaker. It is a COVID-given slot to connect the eminent Professor Dr. Joseph Dorairaj with the people from universities and abroad to remote rural area in India. I am much pleased to welcome you, sir, on behalf of the management, especially on behalf of the principal, to illuminate the virtual room. We welcome you, sir. We are immensely happy to have our principal, who is the guiding star always. Her presence today adds strength to proceed further in the journey we are marching. On behalf of the organizing committee, I express my heartfelt welcome, sister.
Thank you.
In this virtual room, I can recognize some famous professors' names or as participants from universities across the world. You all worked tirelessly in sustaining the spirit of teaching to the needy. We welcome you all with grateful hearts, professors. We are astounded to feel the grace of the Lord, who has made us an instrumental force to set the virtual platform in which more than 575 passionate minds have started traveling with us in Telegram group for the 3-week intellectual journey, which becomes an opportunity for all of us to enjoy in meaningful learning in isolation. Thank all the participants for taking the time to feel the joy of intelligence with us. I wish you all a very successful webinar. Once again, I welcome one and all. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your congenial welcome address. The key to growth is the introduction of higher dimensions of consciousness into our awareness. Now, I welcome Mrs. U. Anamika, Assistant Professor of English, JAC, to introduce the speaker.
It's indeed a golden opportunity, and I'm glad and privileged to introduce our most renowned guest speaker, Dr. Joseph Dorairaj, Professor of English, the School of English and Foreign Languages, the Gandhigram Rural Institute, Dean to the University Gandhigram. Better than 1,000 days of diligent study is one day with a great teacher. This adage is exactly true to our professor, who has enthralled the audience of the world through his expertise on variety of topics in language, literature, and literary theories. Our dear professor has helped innumerable students to formulate their research. His extensive reading and comprehensive knowledge, endowed with inexplicable reflective research deliberations have built the lives of many students far and wide. Professor has served in many capacities as Vice Chancellor of Gandhigram Rural Institute in the year 2013-14, visiting Professor of Philosophy at Satyanilayam, Osmania University, founder and editor of Gandhigram Literary Review, assessor of NAC since 2010, involved in the preparation of NAC revised methodology, visited educational institutions at Washington, Belgium, and Rome. He also conducted a month-long teacher training program in Sri Lanka, published 52 articles, authored 5 books, guided 16 PhD candidates, and has educated more than 100 PhD theses. Sir is an expert of literary theory, and today he is going to enrich us on the topic critiquing canon. Without much delay, I hand over the platform to our dear erudite professor. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Good evening, dear friends.
Good evening,
Am
sir.
I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, sir.
Reverend Dr. Queensley Jayanti, Secretary, JAYARAJ ANNAPACKIAM College, Periyakulam. Reverend Dr. S. Jaisurani, Principal, JAYARAJ ANNAPACKIAM College, Periyakulam. I am indebted to Reverend Dr. Jaisurani, Principal. In fact, I was a little unwell for the last 2 days, and 2 days back she rang me up and inquired about her health, and I was touched. Thank you, sister. You're not only a dynamic administrator, but also a kind-hearted individual, and I am happy to be associated with your institution. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Patricia, Head of the Department of English, JAC Periyakulam. Mrs. Angeline, Coordinator of this Golden Jubilee webinar series. Mrs. Anamika, Convener of today's webinar. Mrs. Monica, the Organizing Secretary for today's webinar. And my dear colleagues, good evening to all of you. I am delighted to meet you virtually, and I thank the Department of English at JAC Periyakulam. In particular, I would like to thank the head of the department, Dr. Patricia, for inviting me to deliver this lecture on critiquing the canon. Now, dear friends, my talk is divided into 4 sections. In the first part of my presentation, I would like to answer 2 questions, namely, what is canon and what constitutes the canon? I will also speak very briefly on canon formation. So that is the first part of the presentation. In the second part of the presentation, I would like to take up the question, what is wrong with the literary canon as it exists today? So why is there a need to critique the canon? Why is there a need to deconstruct or dismantle the canon? I'll be talking about it in the second part of my presentation. In the third part of my presentation, I would like to address 2 questions. I would like to answer 2 questions. Why should we critique and deconstruct the literary canon? And what methodology should we adopt when it comes to critiquing and deconstructing the canon? So that is the third part of the presentation. Now, the fourth part of the presentation, that is the final section, I would like to address teachers who are syllabus designers, who are curriculum designers, who are members of various boards of studies in English. What should we do to critique the canon with a view to including new texts? So this is how I have organized my presentation. Now, before I take up the topic as such, I would like to share with you as to why I have chosen this particular topic. Now, there should be a reason, because today I am talking on critiquing the canon, I am talking on deconstructing the canon, I am talking on dismantling the canon. Now, why did I choose this topic? Now, there are a couple of reasons as to why I chose this topic. Now, firstly, this is a relevant and a meaningful topic. Now, in what sense is it relevant? In what sense is it meaningful? Now, I would like to take you to the newspaper Times of India, dated 26th of August 2021. Okay, so here is the news item taken from the Times of India, dated 26th August 2021. The title goes like this: Delhi University drops stories of Dalit writers from English syllabus. I repeat, Delhi University drops stories of Dalit writers from English syllabus. And there are two short paragraphs. Let me read out the two paragraphs. So here is the first paragraph. And as I said earlier, this has been taken from the Times of India newspaper. So here is the first paragraph. Draupadi, a story by Maheshweta Devi, and the writings of Bama, Faustina Susairaj, and Sugirta Rani, both Dalit feminist writers, were removed from the English syllabus in Delhi University. Despite the resistance of 15 elected members, the Academic Council, which met on Tuesday, approved the chop. I move on to the second paragraph. The second paragraph reads like this. In a co-paper titled Women's Writing in Semester 5, the Oversight Committee has committed the maximum vandalism. It first decided to remove two Dalit authors, namely Bama and Sugirta Rani. Second, the committee, as an afterthought, suddenly asked for the deletion of the celebrated short story of Mahashweta Devi, Draupadi. I'm sure many of you were disturbed by this news item, where three writers were thrown out of the syllabus by the Academic Council of Delhi University. Now, dear friends, I want to remind you that this is not a lone story. This is not a one-off story. There are other stories as well. Okay, I will give you at least three examples. Now, what happened on the 27th of October 2010? As we all know, maybe you can jog your memory, as most of us know, Rohinton Mystery's novel, Such a Long Journey, has been pulled out from the syllabus, and the novel was burned by students at Mumbai University. So this was in 2010. I'll give you two more examples. Now, October 10, 2011, what happened? I'm sure all of us remember Delhi University scrapped A.K. Ramanujan's essay on Ramayana. The 30-page essay by A.K. Ramanujan, which offers a number of tellings of the epic story of Lord Rama, including the Jain, Buddhist, and Kannada narratives, had not gone down well with some sections, some of whom called it blasphemous. Now, I'll give you one more example. Very close to Periyakulaam, you have this Manonmaniyam Sundaranar University, and this news clipping is dated 12th of November 2020. Tamil Nadu's MS University withdraws Arundhati Roy's book Walking with the Comrades from the syllabus after a particular group complained. So, dear friends, now I am sure you know the reason as to why I chose this topic, critiquing the canon or deconstructing the canon or dismantling the canon. Now let me move on to the first part of my lecture. As I said earlier, in the first part of the lecture, I would like to address the question, I would like to answer the question, what is canon? What do we mean by canon? How do we define the canon? Now the word canon, the term canon has two meanings. Now, if you look at the origin of the term canon, if you look at the etymology of the term canon, you realize the origin of the word or the etymology of the word means reed, R-E-E-D. The word gradually came to signify any straight rod or bar, a measuring stick or rod used by masons and carpenters. Eventually, the term assumed a metaphorical connotation and began to mean a norm or standard, something serving to determine, rule, or measure other entities. Now, this is the short quote, and this quote has been taken from the Jerome Biblical Commentary, where an entire chapter has been devoted to the discussion of canon. Now, when they started the program, they had a short Bible reading, and they read a few verses from the book of Psalms. Now, as we all know, the Bible is divided into two parts. We have the Old Testament on the one hand, and we have the New Testament on the other. Books written before the birth of Jesus Christ, they would constitute what is known as the Old Testament, and books that were written after the birth of Jesus Christ, they constitute what is known as the New Testament. So the Bible is divided into two parts. We have the Old Testament and we have the New Testament. Once again, as we all know, the New Testament contains 27 books. We have the 4 Gospels, and the 4 Gospels are followed by Acts of the Apostles, and Acts of the Apostles is followed by different letters or different epistles. And the final book of the New Testament is the book of Revelation, also known as Apocalypse. So, in other words, whether you ask a Protestant Christian or a Roman Catholic Christian, both of them would give you the same version. I repeat, if you ask a Catholic how many books are there in the Old Testament, how many books are there in the New Testament, he or she would answer there are 27 books in the New Testament. So whether it is the Catholic version or the Protestant version, both of them would tell you that there are 27 books in the New Testament. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now let us go to the Old Testament. If you ask a Protestant how many books are there in the Old Testament, and if you were to raise the same question, and if you were to ask a Catholic how many books are there in the Old Testament, you would find a difference. Now, there is absolutely no difference when it comes to the New Testament. Both the Protestant version and the Catholic version, they would tell you in an identical fashion that there are 27 books. Whereas when we come to the Old Testament, we have 2 different versions, we have 2 different numbers. While the Catholic version would tell you that there are 46 books. The Protestant version and some other traditions, they would tell you, no, it is not 46, it is only 39. So the Protestants would tell you the Old Testament consists of 39 books, whereas the Catholics would tell you that there are 46 books in the Old Testament. So which means there is a gap. There is a gap of 7 books. Now, what are these 7 books, and why have these 7 books been omitted? Now, these 7 books are called apocryphal. So that is the theological term. So these 7 books, what are the 7 books? I'll give you the list shortly. So these 7 books, according to the Protestants, they are apocryphal. And what are they? They include Tobit, Judith, Baruch, Sirach. In some versions, Sirach, it is called Ecclesiastes, 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, and Wisdom. So these are the 7 books. And according to some traditions, particularly according to the Protestant version, they are called apocryphal, which is a theological term. Now, I would like to use another term, a simpler term, a term that we are discussing today. These 7 books are also called non-canonical. Okay, so Tobit, Judith, Baruch, Sirach, 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, and Wisdom. The Protestants would call them non-canonical, whereas the Catholics would call them canonical. In particular, they would call them deuterocanonical. Now, dear friends, why did I give you this story? Why did I give you this narrative? The origin of the term canon lies here. So if you want to trace the origin of the term canon, you have to go back to the Bible. You have to go back to the Old Testament. You have to go back to the 7 books. While the Catholics would call these 7 books canonical or deuterocanonical, the Protestants would call them apocryphal or non-canonical. In other words, the word canon or a canonical book is that which has been accepted. A canonical book is that which has been recognized. A canonical book is that which has been authorized. Why? It has been considered worthy. It is considered great. It is considered excellent. Therefore, it has been accepted and organized. So, dear friends, I'm trying to answer the question, what is canon? What do we mean by canon? So this is the origin of the term canon, and we have to go back to the Bible in order to talk about the origin of the word canon. Fine. But in the literary domain, what does the word canon mean? So we have talked about the meaning of the term canon, the definition of the term canon, and the connotations of the term canon from a biblical point of view. Now let us talk about the meaning, the connotation of the term canon from a literary point of view. Fine. Now, from a literary point of view, from a literary perspective, the word canon has two meanings. Okay, so the first meaning of the word canon, it is an authoritative and definitive list of works of an author, very important, usually a dead author. Now you have a living author like Mahesh Dattani or Bama. What happens? Whatever they write, they have the soft copy, they have the hard copy, then there is absolutely no quarrel about the genuineness or the authenticity of their works, because they have both the soft copies, the hard copies, so everything is immediately available. But whereas in the case of an author like Chaucer, an author like Shakespeare, an author like Marlowe, because they did not preserve the manuscripts, we are not 100% sure, we are not absolutely sure whether a particular text was written by these authors or by somebody else. For instance, we say Shakespeare has written so many sonnets. Now let us imagine 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 15 years from now, suddenly they dig up a sonnet and they say, oh, this sonnet must have been written by Shakespeare. Where is the proof? Where is the proof? Of course, they study the vocabulary, they study the syntax, they compare that particular sonnet with the other sonnets. They want to find out if it gels with the other sonnets. Okay, so they have different ways of finding out, but all the same, it eventually lands us in controversy for a very simple reason. The author did not bother to preserve the manuscripts. So in this connection, we talk of Shakespeare canon, we talk of Chaucer canon, we talk of Marlowe canon. And here is the short quote by Kermode, a brilliant essay on canon. The title of the essay is Institutional Control of Interpretation. So he says, Hamlet, one of the four big tragedies, Hamlet belongs to the canon, whereas the Yorkshire tragedy, it is a play in only 10 scenes, originally assigned to Shakespeare, but later assigned to Thomas Middleton, that belongs to the Apocrypha, that is non-canonical. So which means there is a controversy, particularly with the case of dead authors who lived long back and did not bother to preserve the manuscripts. So dear friends, this is the first meaning of the word canon. Now, the second meaning of the word canon, and this is the meaning that is attributed to the word canon today. We will turn to Matthew Arnold and his 1869 publication, Culture and Anarchy. So Matthew Arnold talked about the best which has been taught and said in the world. Of course, he was not directly talking about the word canon or the term canon, but he was talking about great literature, great poetry, and then he says, the best which has been taught and said in the world. So if you take the cue from Matthew Arnold, canon, the second meaning or the second dimension of the word canon would mean a list of great authors and great books. I repeat, so the common understanding of the word canon is, it is a list of great authors, great poets, great playwrights, great short story writers, great novelists. So it is a list of great authors and great books, great poems, great short stories, great novels, great dramas. Okay, now here is the definition of the word canon, and I have taken it from Norton, and there is a reason as to why I have taken this definition from the Norton, because if you go to North America, The canonical textbook prescribed in colleges and universities is the Norton Anthology. So therefore, I have taken this definition of canon from the Norton Anthology. So according to the Norton Anthology, the canon is defined as the range of works that a consensus of scholars, teachers, and readers of a particular time and culture consider great or major. So what is the canon? A list of great authors and a list of great books. Now, who are the great authors? Now, if you talk of British literature, some of the big names, some of the important names would be, some of the outstanding names would be, we have Chaucer, we have Shakespeare, we have Milton, we have Arnold, we have T.S. Eliot, and if we move over to the United States of America, we have some big names like Walt Whitman, Robert Frost, and Scott Fitzgerald. So dear friends, in this context, I would like to draw your attention to a very important book that was published in 1994. The author of the book is Harold Bloom, and the title of the book is Western Canon. The author is Harold Bloom, one of the Yale critics, and the title of the book is Western Canon. And in this book, he talks about 26 great authors. He talks about Chaucer, Dante, Shakespeare, the French playwright Molière. He talks about Milton Johnson. He talks about the American Walt Whitman. He talks about Wordsworth, the Romantic poet. He talks about the Russian novelist and short story writer Tolstoy, Norwegian Ibsen, the Argentinian writer Borges, then Neruda, Pablo Neruda, Samuel Beckett. Then he includes 4 women writers, namely Jane Austen, George Eliot, Virginia Woolf, and Emily Dickinson. Now, if you look at the analysis very closely, if you look at the list very closely, what you find is there are 26 names, there are 26 great authors. Out of these 26 great authors, 22 are men. 22 are men, and only 4 are women authors. Of course, the title of the book is Western Canon. So therefore, we do not find any Asian writer, we do not find any African writer, we do not find Australian writer. Now, if you read the book, Bloom makes it very clear on what basis did he choose these 26 writers who are supposed to be very great or outstanding. So on what basis, or what were the yardsticks, what were the parameters used by Harold Bloom to prepare this list? He talks about 4 parameters or 4 qualities, 4 characteristics. He says the first one is immortality or timelessness. The second one is universality. The third one is originality. And the last one is aesthetic beauty. So on what basis did he select Samuel Beckett or Chaucer or Ibsen or Tolstoy or Molière or Jane Austen? So the 4 characteristics would be immortality, universality, originality, and aesthetic beauty. Now, before I conclude the first section, I would like to clarify. Now, this first section, I have done 2 things. Number 1, I talked about the origin of the term canon. I talked about the etymology of the term canon, and I made it very clear that the term canon has a biblical dimension, because it is from the study of the Bible that we get the term canon. So we need to talk about the word canon from a biblical point of view. At the same time, we need to talk about the word canon from a literary point of view. Now, in this context, I would like to offer a clarification. Now, when we talk about canon in the religious sense, particularly in the biblical sense, we have to realize 2 dimensions. Number 1, it is authoritative. The Holy See, the church authorizes, these are the books to be included, these are the books that are not included. So it is authoritative, and at the same time, it is marked by closure. No new books can be added to the canon. In fact, recently they discovered a 5th gospel, the Gospel of St. Thomas. We already have 4 gospels in the New Testament. So recently they discovered a 5th gospel, the Gospel of St. Thomas, but the church has not accepted it. So when we talk about canon from a religious, from a biblical point of view, we realize that the list prepared by the church is, number one, authoritative, and number two, marked by closure. Whereas when we talk about the canon from a literary point of view, we realize it is not predominantly authoritative. Instead, it is fluid. So which means some books could be deleted and some books could be added. Fine. So dear friends, that was the first part of the presentation. So in the first part of the presentation, I clarified the question, what is canon? What do we mean by canon from a biblical point of view and from a literary point of view? Now in the second section, I would like to answer the question, what is wrong with the canon? So how did we define the canon from a literary point of view? A list of great authors and a list of great books, a list of great authors, a list of great poets, a list of great short story writers, a list of great playwrights, a list of great poets. Now the problem is, who decides that so-and-so is a great author? Or who decides that this particular poem is a great poem? Or who decides that this particular novel is not a great novel? Or who decides that this particular short story is only an average short story, therefore it is not worthy of inclusion in the canon? So the problem is, who decides and on what basis? Now it is here that we realize that there is politics. Who decides so-and-so is a great author, or who decides so-and-so is not a great author? Is it based only on literary considerations, or in addition to literary considerations, there are also other considerations, political, ideological, gender? So which means we realize that there is politics. If I can elaborate it, I will put it this way. There is a strong nexus or an unholy alliance between, number one, race and canon, number two, gender and canon, number three, economic status and canon, and finally, surprisingly, between one's sexual orientation and canon. So which means, I repeat, there is a strong nexus, there is a strong connection, there is an unholy alliance between race and canon. If you are a white, your chances of getting included in the canon are brighter. Whereas if you are black, if you are dark skinned, your chances of getting into the canon are almost nil. Point number one. Point number two, if you are a male writer, your chances of being canonized as a great writer, the chances are very bright. Whereas if you happen to be a woman writer, your chances are only marginal. Okay. And number three, if you are from the upper economic stratum, if you belong to the bourgeois class, then your chances of getting included in the canon, they are bright. If you are a tribal writer, if you are an Adivasi writer, if you are a Dalit writer, then what happens? Your chances are almost nil. And finally, your sexual orientation will also play a major role in deciding whether you're in or whether you're out. If you are a lesbian, your chances are very thin. If you are a gay, your chances are thin. So therefore, what we realize is, we realize that the canon is, I will use four terms. The canon is androcentric, the canon is Eurocentric, the canon is bourgeois, and the canon is homophobic. I repeat, when we talk of the literary canon, particularly who makes the choice, who makes the selections, on what basis is the choice made, on what basis is the selection made, then we realize that there is politics, there is an unholy alliance. So therefore, we realize, we come to the conclusion that the literary canon is androcentric, Eurocentric, bourgeois, homophobic. I will talk about it a little later, but before that, I would like to raise three questions. So when we talk of canon, when we talk of great literature, when we talk of great novels, when we talk of great poems, when we talk of great short stories, we need to ask three questions. And what are the three questions? The first question that we need to raise is, whose histories are narrated and whose histories are marginalized or erased? So that is the first question. The second question, whose stories are highlighted and whose stories are marginalized? And the third question, whose voices are heard and valued and whose voices are silenced and devalued? Okay, so in other words, we go back to where we started. The Academic Council of the Delhi University throughout Bama, throughout Sugitarani, and threw out of the window a very famous short story called Draupadi by Maheshwata Devi, a celebrated writer. Now the question is, who decides that Bama should be out? On what basis, on what considerations, literary, political, ideological? So who decides that Bama should be out? In the same vein, who decides that Sugita Rani should be out? On what basis? Academic considerations or political considerations or ideological considerations? And the third question, who decides Draupadi should be out of the syllabus? A celebrated short story by Mahashweta Devi. So it is against this backdrop that I talked about the canon as being number one, androcentric, number two, Eurocentric, number three, bourgeois, and number four, homophobic. So what do we mean by androcentric? Andro. So if you go back to the Greek root, it says man. So if you look at great writers all over the world, including India, if you look at the great novelists, if you look at the great poets, if you look at the great short story writers, suddenly you realize, it dawns on you that they all happen to be men. 90%, 95% are men writers. Of course, now the scenario is changing in the last 25, 30, 35 years. But before that, it was preponderantly male writers. So the canon is androcentric. And please remember, this is not an accident. This is deliberate. Women were kept out of the canon. Women were pushed out of the canon. So the canon is androcentric. And who are these men? They are all white men, Anglo-Americans. So the canon is not only androcentric, but the canon is also Eurocentric. So white men. So the canon comprises, or the canon consists of, predominantly white male writers who are also rich, who also belong to the upper economic strata. So therefore, the canon is not only androcentric and Eurocentric, it is bourgeois, meaning it is elitist. If you are a tribal writer, if you are an Adivasi writer, if you are a Dalit writer, if you are a writer steeped in poverty, then your chances of getting into the canon, they are dim. I'll give you an example. You take the author of Kochereti. Kochereti is a novel in Malayalam. It won the Sahitya Academy Award. Very interestingly, if you look at the history of the publication of the book, Narayan completed the novel in 1988, and he was desperately searching for a publisher, and it took him 10 long years. The novel was completed in 1988, but the novel was published only in 1998. And sadly, during the meantime, what happened was one publisher even lost the manuscript. Why? A major reason would be, of course, not the only reason. A major reason is, after all, he is an Adivasi writer. Okay, so the canon is androcentric, Eurocentric, and bourgeois. And the last dimension is the canon is also homophobic. What do we mean by this? Your sexual orientation, that too plays a major role in deciding whether you're in the canon or out of the canon, whether you will be canonized as a great writer or not. If you're a gay, if you're a lesbian, till recently, of course, times are changing. Okay, till recently, if you're a gay or if you're a lesbian, then your chances of getting canonized, they are very dim. I'll give you 3 examples. Now, let us take the British novelist Radcliffe Hall. In 1928, her novel bearing the title The Well of Loneliness was published. It was published by Jonathan Cape. The novel was published, and the novel talked about lesbianism. So Radcliffe Hall, an English novelist, her novel bearing the title The Well of Loneliness, it was published in 1928 and it dealt with lesbianism. Shortly after the novel was published, the novel was banned. Why? It talked about a controversial theme. And there is a long history. So this is my first example. My second and third example, you look at two American poets, one a white and the other an African American. You take Adrienne Rich. Adrienne Rich, a white American poet. Of course, her books were not banned. She was primarily a poet. Her poems were not banned, but the amount of torture and persecution that she suffered because she was a lesbian writer, that is untold. So similar is the case of Audre Lorde, an African American poet who described herself as black, lesbian, mother, warrior, and poet. So in other words, when we take a close look at the canon, we realize that the list is occupied predominantly by white, male, Anglo-European heterosexuals. In other words, the canon is dominated by dead white guys. I repeat, the canon is dominated by dead white guys. Therefore, one of the agenda of feminism or post-colonialism or cultural studies is to critique the canon, to deconstruct the canon, and to dismantle the canon, and subsequently rewrite or reformulate or reconstitute the canon. So dear friends, I have finished the second part of the presentation. In the first part of the presentation, I made an attempt to answer the question, what is canon? How do we define the canon? In the second part of my presentation, I highlighted the fact that the canon is distorted. The canon is not all right. Why? Because the canon is androcentric, Eurocentric, bourgeois, and homophobic. Therefore, the canon has to be critiqued, has to be deconstructed, has to be subverted, has to be dismantled. Fine. Now, in the third part of the presentation, I will talk about how to critique the canon or how to deconstruct the canon. Fine. Now, we have two options. So the question that I need to address in the third part of my presentation is what methodology should we adopt when it comes to critiquing the canon or deconstructing the canon or dismantling the canon? Fine. Now, there are two options available. Now, the first option, it is a facile and a simplistic option. Okay, so what do? Here is a list of 100 great poets. So what do? You remove 4 or 5 names, and in those slots, you include maybe a couple of Indians, a couple of Africans, and a couple of South Americans. Okay, are you happy? Are you satisfied? So this is one way of rewriting or reformulating the canon. So you tinker with the list, you delete a few names. Okay, so here is a list of 100 great poets. Remove 27, remove 42, remove 78, remove 91. So there are 4 vacant slots. So the first slot, you fill that slot with an Indian. The second slot, you fill that slot with an African. The third slot, you fill that slot with a Latin American. Okay, so this is one way of rewriting or reformulating the canon. But I'm sure you will agree with me that this is not the way to go about. Okay, fine. Now, let us turn to 3 Australian critics who are big names in the domain of post-colonial studies. All of us are familiar with these names: Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin. Okay, so they are the authors of The Empire Writes Back, and a little later they came up with an edited volume, Post-Colonial Studies, a reader. Now, they have come up with a good solution. Deletion, addition, that's not going to solve the problem when it comes to rewriting or reconstituting or reformulating the canon. Fine. On the contrary, Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin, they suggest you raise some fundamental questions. Now you say Shakespeare is a great writer. You say Ibsen is a great writer. You say Sylvia Plath is a great writer. Now the question that you need to ask, the question that you need to raise is, on what basis were these writers canonized? On what basis were these writers selected? What were the parameters? What were the criteria that were used to canonize these authors? So the problem is not with the list, because the list is only the outcome. The problem is with the criteria, with the evaluation criteria, with the yardstick. So therefore, the post-colonial critics, namely Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin, they would tell us, critique the parameters, critique the evaluation criteria. So once the evaluation criteria or the evaluation parameters are set right, then the list automatically corrects itself. Okay, so these are the two suggestions. In other words, what we have to do is, all of us are aware, all of us are clear that the canon as it exists today should be critiqued, should be subverted, and should be reformulated. And we have two suggestions. The first one is a simplistic suggestion. So the suggestion is to remove a few names, and in those vacant slots to include a few other names. Now, this is not going to solve the issue. On the contrary, a better way of reformulating the canon is not to look at the list as much as looking at the evaluation criteria or the evaluation parameters. Because once you set right the evaluation criteria, the yardsticks, the parameters, then you can be more or less sure that the outcome or the result would be acceptable or would be better. So in other words, what we have to do is, we have to do two things. Number one, we have to operate at two levels. So level one, we have to deconstruct the canon, we have to critique the canon, we have to deconstruct the canon, and we have to reconstitute or rewrite or reformulate the canon. So this is level one. Now there is another level, level two, a higher level, where you challenge the idea of canonical literature as such. Now this is something interesting. I will talk about it a little later. So we have to work at two levels. At level one, you critique the canon, and then you make attempts to rewrite or reformulate or reconstitute the canon. So this is level one. Level two, the idea of literature as such, now it is undergoing enormous change, enormous transformation. Now that we have cultural studies, we have graphic novels, we have digital humanities, we have medical humanities, the whole idea of literature is undergoing a phenomenal change. So therefore, we need to critique the idea of literature as such, the idea of canonical literature as such. Fine. Now, in this context, that is when we talk of rewriting the canon, I would like to talk about the canon wars, W-A-R-S, the canon battles, the canon wars that erupted in North America in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. And I would refer to three major authors. So the first one is Paul Lauter, the second one is Alan Bloom, and the third, of course, I have already referred to him, Harold Bloom. Now the first one is Paul Lauter. It was Paul Lauter, interestingly, who triggered the whole idea of challenging the canon or critiquing the canon. Now, as students of language and literature, we all know that every year the Modern Language Association, MLA, every year they organize annual conventions. And in 1973, the convention was organized at Chicago. So it was during the Chicago Convention that was organized in 1973 that Paul Lauter launched the discussion in America regarding the canonization of non-white, non-male authors. So he raised a fundamental question. Why is it that we have only male writers in the canon, and why is it that we have only white writers in the canon? Why not include non-whites, and why not include women writers? So it was Paul Lauter during the Chicago Convention in 1973 that he spearheaded the whole idea of revolutionizing the canon. So this was in 1973. In 1987, there was a book that was widely talked about in the United States of America. The title of the book is Closing of the American Mind, and the author is Alan Bloom. Now, please remember, unlike Paul Lauter, Alan Bloom supported traditional Western canon. And he talked about two groups. The first group was known as traditionalists, and the other group, the opposing group or the warring group, was known as multiculturalists. So what are the two groups? So the canon war erupted between traditionalists on the one hand and multiculturalists on the other. Now, who are the traditionalists? And in the same vein, who are the multiculturalists? Now, the traditionalists are those writers and critics who wanted to maintain the purity of the canon. We will have only Shakespeare, we will have only Chaucer, we will have only Milton, we will have only T.S. Eliot. We will not include any more writers into the canon. We will preserve the purity of the canon. So they were the traditionalists. Now, on the contrary, the multiculturalists, look at the term multiculturalists, they wanted to expand the canon. They wanted to expand the perimeter of the canon. How? They wanted to include women writers because the canon was preponderantly androcentric. They said, a lot of women writers are coming out. Why not include some of them? Why not include some good women writers? So this was their plea. This was their argument. And they didn't stop with it. Why not include writers of color? Why not include some African Americans? Why not include some black writers? Okay, so there was a war between, the canon war between traditionalists who wanted to maintain the purity of the canon and the multiculturalists who wanted to expand the canon by including women writers and writers of color. Okay, so there was a battle. Now, the problem was essentialism versus multiculturalism. Now, the whole question was, do you go for quality or do you go for expansion? So the traditionalists swore by the name of quality, whereas the multiculturalists, they swore by the name of expansion. So I have talked about Paul Lauter, who launched who spearheaded the widening or the spreading of the canon by including more women writers and by including non-white writers. And I have also talked about Alan Bloom. And third, I would like to talk about Harold Bloom, the Western canon. Of course, I have already talked about Harold Bloom's The Western Canon, where he talks about 26 great authors. And he also talks about on what basis did he include these writers. He talks about originality, universality, timelessness, and aesthetic beauty. Now, in this context, I want to touch upon another dimension of Harold Bloom. Now, Harold Bloom, we all know Harold Bloom for two things. We remember Harold Bloom for two things. One is the author of the brilliant essay, The Anxiety of Influence. And we also know Harold Bloom as one of the 4 Yale deconstructors. Fine. Okay. Now, we should also know that Harold Bloom was the fierce critic of cultural studies. Please remember Harold Bloom's book, The Western Canon, was published in 1994. And by the time, cultural studies as a discipline has firmly entrenched itself not only in British universities, in American universities and elsewhere also. So which means the idea of literature as such was being debated. What is literature? What is non-literature? Now, when I was a student 35 years ago, We did not have any discussion because there was no need for discussion. Oh, this is literature, this is non-literature. The boundary lines were very clear. The line of demarcation was very clear. But today we are not very sure. Why? A film is considered part of literature. Comics are considered part of literature, okay, in the domain of cultural studies. So therefore, I am referring to Harold Bloom for a separate reason here. He was against the idea of literature as it was advocated and being promoted by cultural studies. So because he was afraid that cultural studies collapsed the distinction between pure literature and cultural artifacts. And he also argued that in the name of cultural studies, non-literary texts, I repeat, in the name of cultural studies, non-literary texts such as Batman comics are smuggled into English classrooms. And he was afraid that very soon English departments in North America will be converted into cultural studies departments. Okay, fine. So dear friends, in the third section, what I have done is I have talked about the canon wars. I refer to Paul Lauter, I refer to Paul Bloom, and I also refer to Harold Bloom. And basically, there were two arguments in the second section. Number one, how do we reformulate the canon? Not by deleting a few names and adding a few names in those vacant slots, but by critiquing the evaluation criteria. And at a higher level, we also need to challenge the idea of literature, the canonical idea of literature. Fine. Now we go to the last section of the presentation. Now the last section of the presentation. So in the first part, I addressed this question, what is canon? How do we define the canon? In the second part of the presentation, I pointed out what is wrong with the canon. And in the third part, I talked about what is the methodology that we should adopt when it comes to critiquing the canon and subsequently reconstituting or reformulating the canon. Fine. Now, in the last part of the presentation, I would like to talk about what are the duties and what are the responsibilities of teachers, not so much students, responsibilities of teachers when it comes to critiquing the canon and rewriting and reformulating the canon. Why? Because as teachers, we are responsible for syllabus design. We are responsible for curriculum design. As teachers, we are members of boards of studies in English of our own institution and other colleges and universities. And some of us are also members of academic councils, and academic councils are the bodies that ratify the syllabus passed by individual departments and individual boards of studies. So as teachers, because we are the ones who frame the syllabus for the paper on British literature, for the paper on American literature, for the paper on translation, for the paper on comparative literature, for the paper on ELT. So as teachers, what should we do? What are our duties and what are our responsibilities? So I would like to talk of 5 important points, and with that, I would like to wrap up my presentation. Fine. Now, as a teacher, I would like to encourage my students to have a personal canon. Now, we have great authors listed in the syllabus, whether it is British literature or comparative literature or regional literatures in translation or American literature or Indian English literature. Okay, so that is what the department has framed. That is what the department has decided. But I would like to encourage my students to have a personal canon. Okay, so students should know who are their favorite poets. They should be aware of which novelists they like, which playwrights they like, and which texts they like, which texts they do not like. And they should also be able to articulate as to why they like a particular writer, why they like a particular text. So therefore, it is the duty, it is the responsibility of individual teachers to encourage our students to have a personal canon, and my duty as a teacher would be to curate the list for my students. So this is the first on the agenda. As teacher, my responsibility is to encourage my students to have a personal canon, their own individual list, their own personal list of authors whom they like and authors whom they do not like, texts which they like and texts which they do not like, and also the reason for their choice, for their individual choice. Fine. So this is point number one. Point number two, as a teacher, I am a member of the Board of Studies of English in my own university, and I also serve as a member of the Board of Studies in many colleges and many universities across the country. And I am also a member of the Academic Council. I was and I am right now. Okay, fine. So which means as a syllabus designer, as a curriculum designer, I have an added responsibility. Now, for instance, my head of the department asked me to frame the syllabus for American literature. What do? I consciously, I would like to underline the word, I would consciously include women writers and African American writers. So let me include Langston Hughes. Let me include Alice Walker. Let me include Rita Dove. Let me include Paul Marshall. Let me include Ralph Ellison consciously. So which means when you have the freedom, when you have the responsibility of designing the syllabus for a particular paper, it could be for American literature, it could be for Indian English literature, it could be for regional literatures in translation. So what you do is you consciously include women writers. And if it is American literature, you consciously include African American writers. Sometimes, I am not exaggerating, when you look at the syllabus of a few colleges and a few universities, you are horrified. Okay, you look at the syllabus of American literature as prescribed by some colleges, you hardly find any African American writer. Okay, some institutions, they have two papers. They have a paper on American literature, the mainstream writers. They also have another paper, a second paper on African American literature. But some institutions, I am not exaggerating, if you look at the syllabus they are prescribed for American literature, it is predominantly white. And this is a grave injustice. So therefore, the second duty of the staff member is when you are assigned to draft the syllabus for a particular paper, you should consciously include the so-called non-canonical writers. This is how we expand the canon. This is how we expand the perimeter of the canon. So this is second on the agenda. Third on the agenda, in many institutions, what they do is, okay, they introduce a paper on Dalit literature. They introduce a paper on subaltern literature. They introduce a paper on gender studies. Fine. Okay, fine. So the choice is good. I appreciate the teachers. I appreciate the head of the department, and I appreciate the entire department for having made a conscious choice and pitching in for, let us say, Dalit literature or subaltern literature or gender studies. Now, dear friends, this is only step one. Now, there is a step two, which most of us do not do. Okay, prescribing a novel by Bama is good, but that is not enough. Prescribing a couple of poems by Sugita Rani is good, but that's not enough. Prescribing the autobiography of Limbale, that is good, but that is certainly not enough. Then what else? What else should I do as a teacher? Now, what I should do as a teacher is, you have the mainstream aesthetics and you have the Dalit aesthetics or the subaltern aesthetics or the gendered aesthetics. So you should make your students aware of what are the basic differences or what are the crucial differences between the so-called mainstream aesthetics and the Dalit aesthetics or the gendered aesthetics or the subaltern aesthetics. Now, unfortunately, in many institutions, they don't do it. They would teach Bama as they would teach Jane Austen. They would teach Sugita Rani as they would teach Emily Dickinson. So for them, it is a poem. Okay. Now, what you have to do is you have to operate at two levels. Number one, you expand the canon by including Bama or Sugita Rani or Limbale, but that's not enough. You need to highlight how Dalit aesthetics, Dalit language, Dalit ideology is different from the mainstream aesthetics, the mainstream ideology. Okay, so that the students have to be made aware of. Otherwise, there is no point in prescribing a novel by Bama if you fail to highlight the Dalit aesthetics. Okay, if you have the money, if you're from an upper caste, if you're from an upper economic stratum, you can sit by a pond, sip your tea or coffee and write a poem about the rainbow, or write a poem about the lotus, or write a poem about the sunset. But these people who are struggling for their existence, they don't have the time, they don't have the leisure, they don't have the means to write poetry about the rainbow or the lotus or the rose or the sunrise or the sunset. Why? Because life is harsh. So therefore, they have a different aesthetics. Okay, so two things. Number one, include more texts, expand the canon, but at the same time, introduce identity politics, which talks about questions of difference. Now, the fourth point is, if we are planning to expand the canon, if you are planning to reconstitute the canon, if you are planning to reformulate the canon, then one of the strategies is, of course, the main strategy or the key strategy would be to somehow include these authors or push these authors into the syllabus, because that is one sure way of canonizing these authors. So in addition to that, if we have to promote Dalit literature, or if we have to promote refugee literature, or if we have to promote transgender literature, or if we have to promote regional literatures in translation, then what we can do is, I'm sure all colleges, all universities, every year, that is they organize an annual seminar or an annual convention or an annual workshop. So if you are planning to introduce some authors, if you are planning to introduce, let us say, transgender literature or refugee literature or regional literatures in translation, then consciously choose this particular theme as the topic for your annual seminar, because that would initiate, that would open up the debate for not only the critiquing of the canon, but the reformulation of the canon. And my last suggestion is, if you want to include a particular author, a particular literature in your syllabus, then promote research on these authors and texts. Almost in all colleges, MA students write research projects. Okay, give them topics like, okay, Dalit literature, subaltern literature, transgender literature, regional literatures in translation. So consciously give them such topics, and this is how we canonize these authors and bring them into the fold. So dear friends, before I conclude, I would like to make it clear that the boundaries of the literary canon are fluid and porous. I repeat, the boundaries of the literary canon are fluid and porous, and therefore changes are possible. Changes are certainly possible. So therefore, step one, we shall critique the canon, we shall deconstruct the canon, we shall dismantle the canon, and step two, we shall try to canonize more authors, particularly women authors and authors from other socio-economic, cultural, ideological, political backgrounds who are not part of the mainstream. So let us critique the canon, and on the other hand, let us rewrite the canon. Thank you very much. And I thank the head of the department, Dr. Patricia, in a very special way, and my gratitude to the principal, Dr. Jaisurani, for this invitation. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Sir, the talk was indeed a feast to our ears, and we are spellbound again by your unparalleled lecture, which have brought forth many more research content to the society. I have no doubt that the participants might have cherished this remarkable and noteworthy event. Thank you so much, sir. And then,
Thank you.
before moving into question answer sessions, I have a question personally. So, when you talked about bourgeois society, I was thinking about the problems encountered by Kierkegaard and Socrates. Okay, so it made me to think that the human origin and the origin of canon both are the same. What's your opinion, sir?
You refer to Kierkegaard and Socrates.
Yes, sir.
Can you please elaborate, Anamika? Like, why did you talk of Kierkegaard and why did you talk of Socrates?
So
And
Socrates,
how do you club these two?
yes, actually, Kierkegaard's inspiration is from Socrates, and Socrates suffered from, I think, the problem of canon. Okay, he wanted to make the youth to ask questions. That was the problem there. So Kierkegaard too, he was actually he's expelled from the church when we read the history of Kierkegaard. So both suffered from bourgeois society. So Socrates died at the year 399 BC. So I'm beginning to think that whether the origin of canon and the human origin might be the same. So when the first human born in the world, the problem of canon also started. So it's just I wanted to know your deliberations.
No, Anamika, I am not sure. I am not sure because your postulate is, your point is the origin of the canon and the origin of the human race, they coincide. So this is your argument.
Yes.
I am not very sure about it. I am not very sure about it. So the second point that I want to talk about is like whether it was Kierkegaard, as you rightly pointed out, and Socrates. So both of them were non-traditional. Both of them opposed to tradition. Okay, so what did Socrates do? What was the crime committed by Socrates, and why was he forced to drink hemlock? Why was he forced to drink poison? Because he taught the youth of Athens, he taught the Athenian youth to question, to interrogate, to critique. And the elders did not like it. So they saw him as a threat. So is the case with Kierkegaard. Okay, so I would like to see Socrates and Kierkegaard as people who opposed tradition and not so much as the origin of canon. Okay, thank you.
So there is a question in the chat box. Then from Krishna Nand, he asked, "What is the definition of great? How do we decide the greatness of any author?"
Okay, fine. Now this is an interesting question, and this is the question that I have been repeatedly raising. Okay, who decides so and so is great, and on what basis? So how do we define greatness? So we have three questions. How do we define greatness? Who is great? And on what basis is an author deemed to be great? I mean, these are difficult questions. These are controversial questions. If you say on the basis of originality, then once again, what is originality? That is opening a Pandora's box, opening a can of worms. Okay, who decides what is original and what is not original? And Harold Bloom talks about 4 criteria on the basis of which a writer is considered great or otherwise. And what are the 4 criteria? Originality, timelessness, universality, aesthetic beauty. And the last point is a controversial point. What is aesthetics? What is mainstream aesthetics? What is Dalit aesthetics? And that is why I told you, if you belong to a rich society, you can sit by the garden, sip your Taj tea, or that is the advertisement. You enjoy the dance of the peacock because you have the money, you have the leisure, you have the time. But if you're a coolie, you're not sure of your next meal, then obviously you can't be enjoying the sunrise or the sunset. So the mainstream aesthetics doesn't apply to you. Okay, so therefore the question is, what is greatness? Controversial. Who decides what is great? That is also controversial. That is why at the beginning of my presentation, I made it very clear. I talked about three authors, Bama, Sugirtarani, Mahashweta Devi. So their texts were thrown out from the syllabus. Now, is this on the basis of academic considerations or political considerations or religious considerations or ideological considerations? Now, these are open for debates. Okay, so therefore, what I would like to say is the whole idea or the whole concept of greatness is controversial. We cannot define it either this way or that way. It is controversial. It is slippery. We cannot define it.
One more question, sir. Sir, you spoke about the non-representation of subaltern writers on their works, but certain topics on indigenous leaders like Velunchia or people like them are not even finding any space for representation. What is your opinion on this issue, sir?
Okay, fine. Now the point is, yes, we have to include more writers into the canon, and this will not happen overnight. This is not going to happen overnight. Okay, so this will take years. So what you do is first you organize a seminar on a particular writer or a particular branch of literature. Then maybe when your students are looking for topics, when your students are searching for topics for their BA projects, for their MA projects, give them. And this is how you slowly try to canonize these so-called marginalized writers. So the path is not easy. The path is certainly not easy, and changes are not going to happen overnight. So this is a long, laborious, elaborate process, but I'm sure that this will happen simply because people have realized that the canon is narrow, that the canon is constricted. So therefore, there is a dire need to expand the canon. Okay, because of this awareness, because of this consciousness, I am sure change will set in, but we cannot expect miracles or dramatic changes overnight. So this will happen over a period of time.
Sir, another question from YouTube participant, Smita VK. Yeah, she asked, sir, we see a lot of recent researches on selfies and social media stories. Will these mundane, everyday expressions be one day become canonical text as part of life writing or autobiographies?
No, I am not a prophet. I can't say whether this will be one day included in the canon. No, when I talked about cultural studies, we have to remember three things. Okay, the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, established in 1964 by Richard Hoggett and later spearheaded by Stuart Hall. Okay, so they did three things. Cultural studies has done three things. Number one, while sociology and anthropology looked at culture from a functional point of view, cultural studies made an attempt to look at culture from a political, ideological point of view. Point number one. Point number two, cultural studies veered away from the mainstream aesthetics and focused on popular culture, especially films and comics. And number three, cultural studies focused on ordinary cultural artifacts. So the question that was raised, it belongs to the third dimension. So cultural studies focuses on ordinary cultural artifacts that we use in day-to-day lives. Okay, so whether this will become canonical, whether this will be canonized, I do not know. But my gut feeling is this is not going to happen. This is not going to happen. The trend will change.
And now, question from Valarmati Suresh. So, can we approach the rewriting of Indian myths as critiquing the canons? Your deliberation on recent mythical writings, sir.
Okay, fine. Now, this is an interesting question, and I have done some work in the field of mythology. Now, the key word here is rewriting. Now, please remember, any rewriting is ideological. Any rewriting is oppositional. Okay, you want to reread a novel, you want to reread a myth, you want to reread a story. So in this process, what you attempt to do is you want to critique the conventional understanding and the conventional interpretation and try to look at it from an oppositional point of view. That is the whole idea of rereading. Okay, we have a novel like Jane Eyre. When you want to reread, so what you do is you want to contest the mainstream reading. So that is why it's Argo so see. So rereading could be from a gendered point of view, rereading could be an ideological point of view. So any rereading, if I can put it in one word, is an oppositional reading, whether it is rereading of a novel or rereading of a myth. You want to contest the traditional understanding and the conventional interpretation. So that is the meaning of rereading.
Right. Another question from YouTube, sir. It is an excellent presentation, sir. I have a question on what are the most accessible novels in the literary canon?
What are the most accessible novels? All of us know like the novels of George Eliot, the novels of Thomas Hardy, the novels of Jane Austen. And these novels are most accessible for a very simple reason. Of course, they are great. But more than that, they have been around for a very long time. So therefore, people have heard of them, people have seen them, people have read them, people have researched them simply because they have been there for a long time. Okay, if you're there in a college or a university for 20 years, 25 years, everybody knows you. Whereas if you join the college only 3 months back or only 1 year back, it is quite likely that very few people have noticed you. So the great books, they have been there for a long time. And therefore, one of the reasons, okay, not the only reason, one of the reasons is because they have been around for quite some time, they have been noticed, they have been read, they have been analyzed, they have been written about. Okay, so this is one main reason.
Dr. Joe, this is Professor
Yes.
Anthony Sami.
Okay, Professor Anthony Sami is head of the Department of English at Loyola College, Chennai. Yes, Dr. Anthony Sami.
Joe, as usual, your lecture was crystal clear, and I would like to congratulate you and also the organizers for such a nice lecture that they have organized. Listening to you definitely was a intellectual feast to all of us, as one
Thank
of
you.
the participants mentioned. Definitely, this is the topic that I would have longed for, because as you know, you are the academic council member of Loyola College. We are at the phase of restructuring our post-graduation syllabi. Now, the idea of canonical literature is very clear, and we need to critique or deconstruct or dismantle the canon and give space to the literatures that have been developed all over the world, definitely. Now, Joe, I just wanted to ask you whether we are also once again opening a Pandora's box. When we dismantle the canon, are we endangering into the realm of including everything and anything? Is there any danger? If there is any particular criteria, or once again, I don't know whether I am going back to the criteria of canon. Do we have to keep in mind whether we certain criteria with which we include the literature that is acceptable? I think I
Okay.
may, yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Tony, for this interesting question. Now, I'm sure you remember during my presentation, I gave the example of the syllabus for American literature. Now, I have seen it, I am not exaggerating, I have seen it in quite a few colleges and universities that if the syllabus for American literature at the MA level, it is predominantly white writers. You hardly have any African American writers. So this is bias, this is prejudice. So this needs to be corrected. Now, Dr. Anthony Sami is suggesting, what if some particular teacher or some particular head of the department or some particular college decides that 80% of the American syllabus will be African American? Is there not a danger? Okay,
Correct.
so on the one hand, your complaint is there is hardly any presence of African American writers. This is a legitimate complaint. Now, if some department out of great enthusiasm, like what if they make 80% of the syllabus African American literature? So isn't there a danger? Now, my answer is yes, there is a danger. But then what happens is you have external experts on your board of studies who vet the syllabus. Then you have the academic council which will ratify. So we have enough checks and balances. Okay, so that way I think we can be sure, not 100% sure, we can be sure that we will not get carried away and rewrite the canon in a mindless fashion. Yes, we need to rewrite the canon, but then it has to be within certain limits. Okay, so there are dangers, but I guess in all institutions, in all colleges, in all universities, there are checks and balances, and syllabus, there is a committee to vet the syllabus before it is passed and ratified. So the danger is there, but of course there are checks and balances as well.
Thank you, Joe, for the answer.
Professor Dorairaj, I'm a teacher, I'm a lecturer at the University of Kannur, Kerala. Your presentation has been wonderful. I really enjoyed listening to you. Thank you very much for that very comprehensive coverage.
Thank you.
This is, I think, more in the form of an observation. I don't know if it's a question at all. Because are you here critiquing the notion of canon or canonicity? Or are you speaking of the importance of expanding existing canons? Now, for instance, I'm thinking of any canon, I mean, even alternative canons that we are speaking about, isn't any canon complicit with powers that be? Can we say that we can escape the canon completely somehow? Since syllabus, the very concept of syllabus, definitionally, it means selection and grading of content. And when we have to grade and select content. Can we, therefore, avoid canonicity properly? Or would you say that canonicity or canon, creating canons, has absolutely no conservative uses at all? Can we say that canons have not expanded in the last few decades? Could you please enlighten us on these issues?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the observation, and many thanks for your warm words of appreciation. Thank you. Now, two things I would like to make it very clear. Now, at the outset, I made it very clear the formation of the canon or the constitution of the canon is political. The canon is riddled with politics, and I also made it clear that the canon is androcentric, Eurocentric, bourgeois, homophobic. So these are all political dimensions. Okay, fine. Now, the second observation that you made is in the last 2 decades or 3 decades, yes, of course, we have expanded the canon. I certainly agree with you. Yes, we have expanded the canon, but I think we need to include more texts. The canon has to be expanded further. What we have done is good, but that's not sufficient. Why? Because so many people are writing literature, so many people are creating literature, so therefore their voices should be heard. It is not only Shakespeare, it is not only Chaucer, it is not only Milton. I'll give you an example. When I was a student at St. Joseph's College, 80 to 85% of my syllabus was British literature. That was the time they introduced American literature. That was the time they introduced Indian writing in English. That time it was called Indian writing in English. Now what has happened? You look at the syllabus of many colleges and universities, British literature has been drastically cut, legitimately. Not that we are doing a disservice to Shakespeare and his coevals. Okay, so that is the place of British literature, because the days of the empire are over. So therefore, your observation, yes, we have expanded the canon, so we are going in the right direction. And as you said, further, we need to expand the canon further, and we need to do it consciously. Thank you. Thank you for this observation.
There are a lot of questions
Thank-
in the
thank you,
chat box. Okay. And next question is from Dr. Meenakshi Kulkarni. How can we have a comparative study of Dalit and Afro-American authors? Can you please give some examples?
Okay, Dr. Meenakshi, that's an interesting question. Now, already a lot of studies have been done. I'll give you a few examples. In fact, I valued a PhD thesis where the candidate had compared the novels of Bama, a Dalit novelist, Tamil novelist, and Alice Walker. So this is one example. And this was done some 10 years ago. And I'll give you one more example. One of my own students, he did a comparative study of Alice Walker and a Malayalam novelist called Sarah Joseph. Of course, Sarah Joseph is not a Dalit writer, okay, but it was a rich study, a rich comparative study. So therefore, Dr. Meenakshi, okay, a lot of studies have been done. Dalit literature and African American literature, particularly the gender dimension. Okay, thank you.
The next question is from Ms. Malar. Thank you for such a wonderful lecture, sir. Women writers as such have become inseparable from what they write. They are judged and held responsible for what they write, especially on controversial subjects. Is this one of the reasons why women have found very less representation in Western canon?
Honestly, I don't know. Now, there are many reasons. This could be one. Okay, now what I would suggest is now this Susitaru and Lalita, they have brought out 2 volumes, Women Writing in India, published by Oxford University Press. Now, the book comes up with a beautiful introduction. Okay, so they answer a series of questions. Questions like why is it that we do not come across many women writers? Is it because they don't write? Is it because they don't have the talent? Or is it because they do write, but unfortunately no publisher came forward to publish their works? So what is the reason? Okay, so they answer a series of questions in a brilliant way. So I would refer the individual who raised this question to read the introduction by Susitaru and Lalita to the volume published by Oxford University Press. The title is Women Writing in India, in 2 volumes.
Next question is from Dr. Rogan Savarimuthu. Good evening from Sri Lanka. I find a similarity between the music industry and the literary industry with regard to canon. Do you think that this by itself is moved by the corporate?
Oh, certainly. Thank you, Dr. Rogan, for this interesting question. Now, I'm sure at least some of you watch CNN and BBC. Okay, now the latest is like Trump, what happened 1 year ago at Capitol Hill. Okay, how did CNN present the news and how did Fox present the news and how Fox controlled Donald Trump when he was the president. Okay, so this would be a very good example of how, just as the world of literature is controlled by canon formation, the world of media also is controlled by big names, the so-called canonical channels or canonical news agencies. So this would be a very good example. Fox and Trump as opposed to CNN and Trump.
So now the next question is from Ms. Ragiba. What about Arnold's touchstone method? Then does it mean that every canon is unique?
See now, Matthew Arnold's touchstone method. Okay, now what exactly does he mean by the touchstone method? He says you take the best poems, or you take the best novels, or you take the best short stories, and then you want to compare it. Okay, so you try to measure it against the so-called canonical poems or canonical novels or canonical films. If it measures, let us say 70%, 75%, 80%, 85%, then it is a good work. Okay, for instance, he says the best line in the world of poetry is "In la sua voluntade e nostro pace." I am sure those of you who have read Matthew Arnold's The Study of Poetry would remember this line. According to him, this is the most famous line in poetry taken from Dante, "In la sua voluntade e nostro pace." So the English translation is "In his will is our peace." Now, Matthew Arnold would tell us, now you keep this as the standard, you keep this as the benchmark, you keep this as the yardstick. Okay, if any poem can come closer to this benchmark, then it is a good poem. If it doesn't measure up to this benchmark, then obviously it is not. Okay, so this is how he would define the touchstone method. And now once again, on what basis? Okay, so Matthew Arnold would say this is on the basis of high seriousness. Okay, so what is high seriousness? Then when you go into the definition of high seriousness, then it becomes controversial. Okay.
The next question is from Ms. Sumati. So what about canonizing history? History has omitted some important contribution of women.
Okay, canonizing history. Now, history itself is very interesting. Now, earlier history was defined as an objective record of the past. Okay, so these are the terms. Okay, objective, not subjective, objective record of the past. But today, historiographers tell us it is not 100% objective. It is always the version of a particular historian. Okay, so therefore, history and canon, they are not always on the same page. Okay, for instance, we talk of the first war of Indian independence, that is the Indian historians, whereas the British historians would contemptuously dismiss it as Sepoy Mutiny. Okay, now which of the two terms is right? Which of the two terms is canonical? Was it Sepoy Mutiny, something to be dismissed, or with a lot of patriotism, was it the first war of Indian independence? Okay, so these are two different perspectives. So if you go into historiography, then historiography makes it very clear how the writing of history is not something easy. Okay, and if you go to new historicism, just as literature is made out of text, okay, history also is made out of textuality. Okay, so history as an objective record of the past is no more an acceptable definition. Whose history, whose version, whose perspective? These are the questions that are raised by historians and historiographers now, and these are valid questions.
Okay, the next one is from Kausi Vinayakam. Even if we reformulate the canon, it would be still biased in some way or the other because it will privilege someone, thereby casting other in the dark. What is your take on it, sir?
Okay, now this question was already raised by the professor from Kannur University. Either way, it is going to be political. If you don't include Dalit writers, it is political. If you include Dalit writers, that also is political. So there is no escaping politics when it comes to the formation of the canon. So we have to live with the political dimensions and the political connotation. So either way, you can't escape it. Okay, so somebody will accuse you, like what Delhi University has done. throughout Burma, throughout Sugita Rani. Now, 3 years ago, what did they do? They included Burma, they included Sugita Rani, saying, oh, these writers are important, these writers are canonical, these writers have to be canonized, they should be there in the syllabus. That was a different board, that was a different academic council. Now, 3 years later, it dawned on them that these writers are not worthy of inclusion in the syllabus. So either way, it is going to be controversial and political, and there is no escaping this brute fact.
Another question from Bindu Sri. The influence of the canon is more, or the noble personalities is more? According to you, who are the better influences on the world, sir?
Anamika, can you please repeat the question?
The influence of canon is more, or the noble personalities is more? According to you, who are the better influencers on the world, sir?
I don't exactly get the question, but then the answer is we talk of grand style. Okay, at the undergraduate level, all of us must have studied about grand style. When we talk of Milton, we talk of Milton's grand style. We talk of Homer's grand style. Now, the important question is, who can write in a grand style? And the answer is not an ordinary soul, not a mean soul, not an average soul. A grand style can come out of only a grand soul and a grand mind. Okay, so this is what we studied in our undergraduate days. A mean person cannot produce a grand novel. An average individual cannot produce a grand style. So 3 things have to go together. 3 dimensions have to gel together. Grand style comes out of a grand soul with a grand mind, with a lofty mind. Okay, so therefore these 3 are inseparable.
Some 2 more questions, sir. There are so many indigenous writers around the world, including Indian writers like Bharat Muni, Anandavardhan, etc. Aren't they greater than the Western writers called to be canons?
No, I don't want to get into any comparison, who is great and who is not so great. Okay, in the domain of Western poetics, Aristotle is a towering figure, is a towering personality, whereas in the Indian scenario, Bharata Muni is outstanding. And the one who talked about the theory of rasa, he is outstanding. So these are 2 different domains. One is in the Western hemisphere, the other is in the Indian hemisphere. Both are equally giants in their respective domains, in their respective cultures and languages.
The next one is from Ms. Komala. Can the 11th century Indian poet and 20th century American poet be compared? Your opinion, please, sir.
No, I cannot answer the question because I need more details. Who is that 11th century poet? Who is the contemporary poet? Is one a poet and the other a novelist? Or if both are poets, have they written on similar themes? In other words, if 2 writers have to be compared, or if 2 writers have to be contrasted, then there should be grounds for comparison and contrast. There should be some similarity and there should be some difference. If there is absolutely no interface or no similarity between 2 writers, then there is no point in comparing these 2 writers.
Okay. There are similarities between the 2 poets. I'm Komla.
No. Okay, no, I do not know. Like, if you are convinced that there are similarities, then you please go ahead.
I have been raised many questions about comparing these 2 poets. I started my PhD research on this too, but I was questioned and stopped. So I'm doubtful.
No, like I cannot give you any categorical answer because I do not have the details and the facts, who are the two writers and what are the points of convergence and what are the points of divergence. Okay, have you already done your literature survey? Has anyone already compared these two writers and what was the outcome? So only if I am aware of these points, then I'll be able to answer your question in a clear and in a comprehensive way.
Can I name the writers, sir?
Beg your pardon?
Can I name the writers?
Okay, yes.
Yeah, one is 11th century Bhakti literature poet Thirumangai Alvar, and the other is
Okay.
American poet Gary Snyder.
Uh-huh.
So, on
No,
the
I'm
basis of
sorry. Please go ahead. On the basis of?
on the basis of eco-critical perspectives, I am trying to compare them
Uh-huh.
because both are nature poets.
Okay. No, I think if you can discuss it with somebody else who is familiar with these two poets, I think that would be more fruitful and productive because I have only a nodding acquaintance of these two authors.
Okay, sir.
I'm sorry, I will not be able to help you in this. Sorry.
It's okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
There are some 3 more questions. Shall we go ahead with, sir?
Oh yes, oh yes.
Sir, if you would set limitations for the canon, what might that be?
No, we are not setting any limitations for canon. What we are arguing is the tradition as such has already set limitations for canon. It has restricted the canon to men and to white men in particular. Okay, so no, we need to break those boundaries and need to bring in more people, particularly women and particularly people of color. Okay, so this is exactly what is happening with regard to the critiquing of the canon and the reformulation of the canon.
So, next question is from Mr. Rangarajan. Who are the Dalit women writers in English, especially from Tamil Nadu?
No, we have quite a few, like we have Bama, then Sivagami, the former IAS officer. I am not an expert in this area, but I can remember because I have read Bama's novels, at least 2 novels and some short stories, and I have also read Sivagami's novels, The Grip of Change, I think. I guess there are more women Dalit writers. My knowledge is a little limited, and I'm sorry about it.
The next question is from Mr. Kamalakannan. Sir, can we compare Toni Morrison novels with Tupukari, Dr. K.M. Kamalakannan?
No, who are Toni Morrison? Yes, we all know. Who is the other writer?
Dr. Kamalakannan.
No. Who is the other writer whom Kamalakannan is proposing?
Tupukari. Thoopukari. Tupukari, sir.
No, I'm sorry. I am not aware of this author. Kamalakannan, I'm sorry. I am not aware of this author.
Okay, sir. Next question. Sir, do you think the existence of canon and desire for the existence in the canon is threatening for the entire wide-ranging literature as politics of power is always there?
Please read this question again. Just 1 second. I will charge my laptop. Please hold on.
Yes, sir.
Madam, the writer name is Malarvadi.
Yes, Anamika, please proceed.
Sir, do you think the existence of canon and desire for the existence in the canon is threatening for the entire wide-ranging literature, as politics of power is always there?
No, the question is not very clear.
Shall I read once again, sir?
Okay, please.
Do you think the existence of canon and desire for the existence in the canon is threatening for the entire wide-ranging literature, as politics of power is always there?
No, still I have not understood the question fully, but all the same I can answer. Now, it is a political decision, and when we say political, it means it carries a lot of power. Okay, so we use the term politics with this particular connotation, that is carrying power, wielding power, exercising power. So when we say it is political, meaning it is related to power, who exerts power, who wields power, who controls. Okay, so therefore the whole talk of canon centers around politics, which is controlled by power.
So excuse me, sir.
Yes, sir.
This is Kamalakannan.
Yes, sir.
Sir, your lecture was fantastic, and you remember us, our former Professor Richard in St. Joseph's College.
Okay, he was my teacher.
Yeah. I was asking the question about Malarvadi Stupakari. Can we compare Malarvadi Stupakari to Toni Morrison's novels?
No, I'm sorry, I have not read this particular novel, sir.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Maybe in future I will read it.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Very informative, sir.
Thank you.
One more question, sir. From Jayaprabha. Thank you, sir. It was an excellent presentation. The question will be, Bama, Maheshweta Devi and other writers that you have mentioned today have proved themselves as writers, but their works are eliminated from the canon. Means, what else could be done by them, sir? They might have struggled to get their books published. Do they have to struggle even after they proved them?
See, now there are two answers. Answer number one, it is not as if the entire country has rejected Maheshweta Devi. It is not as if the entire country has rejected Bama or Sugita Rani. One particular academic council at Delhi University has rejected these three authors. That doesn't mean that the whole country has thrown out Maheshweta Devi or Bama or Sugita Rani. Okay, so this is my first answer. My second answer, even if you look at the traditional canon, the traditional Western canon, we find a lot of ups and downs, we find a lot of fluctuations. For instance, the best example would be you take John Donne. Okay, so you look at the graph of John Donne, it goes up, it comes down, it goes up, it comes down, and the name of John Donne stabilized only after the essay by T.S. Eliot bearing the title Metaphysical Poets. That stabilized him, that cemented his name and fame. Otherwise, Donne was in and out of the canon. And I can give you other examples as well. Or you take F.R. Lewis's famous book, The Great Tradition. Some writers are in, some writers are not in. Okay, so this is a matter of convenient choices and personal choices by individual critics. Okay, so we need not always go by it. So the best example is John Donne. Okay, during his lifetime, Donne was not known well at all. And some say it was only after the edition of Donne's poetry by Grierson that Donne came into prominence. But some others would argue it was only after T.S. Eliot canonized John Donne that he became prominent. Okay, so therefore the graph of many writers, it goes up and down. So let us not worry about it. Maybe according to Delhi University, the present academic council, the graph of Bama has gone down. Maybe it will rise again. Maybe there will be another academic council, okay, who may or may not include Bama back into the syllabus. Okay, so this is like, as Northrop Frye put it in the Archetypes of Literature, this is like the stock market. Okay, so the graph goes up and comes down. The graph goes up and comes down. So the literary fortunes of some writers are like what happens in the stock market.
So I think you have answered all the questions, and there are a lot of comments from the chat box, and one person has said that was my opinion too. The session is flooded with questions, and your patience in answering all is really awesome. Thank you for the wonderful session, sir. So you have answered clearly, and we have. I hope in future also, after listening to your the talk again in YouTube, people will come out with a lot of questions. I hope so. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Anamika. I should thank your head of the department who gave me this opportunity.
Thank you so
ma'am.
much
Thank you.
for giving the emphasis on the role of autonomous institution in canonizing the literature. So thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. We'll give the comments. We'll send the comments of the participants through mail, sir. We'll be sending to you. Okay. So we can't read all the comments, but it should be reached to you. So we will be sending those things. Thanks, sir.
We have come to the closure of the program. Joy is the simplest form of gratitude, says Karl Barth. To express our joy, I invite Mrs. Monica, Assistant Professor of English, JAC, to propose a vote of thanks.
Good evening to one and all gathered here. It's a great privilege for me to propose a vote of thanks at this momentous occurrence. On behalf of the entire fraternity of Department of English, JAYARAJ ANNAPACKIAM College for Women, I express my heartfelt gratitude to the resource person, Dr. A. Joseph Dorairaj, Professor of English, the School of English and Foreign Languages, Gandhigram Rural Institute, Dean to be University, Gandhigram, for being a part of and making this event a grand success. It was indeed a great interactive session. Thank you, sir, for your eloquent and riveting talk on the topic critiquing the canon. I would like to express my gratitude to the management for their constant support and guidance in all our enterprises. I extend my deep sense of gratitude to Dr. G. Patricia Alfin Nirmala, Head and Assistant Professor, Department of English, JAC, for her strenuous efforts in constituting this event and epoch-making. Thank you, ma'am. My sincere and heartfelt thanks to the Faculty of English for their synergistic organization of the event. Thank you, professors. And I thank all the participants, both in the Google Meet and in the YouTube, and from various institutions for their erudite participation who have made this webinar more significant. Thank you, dear participants. Once again, I thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'm happy the session went off well. Thank you, Anamika. Thank you, Monica. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
My special thanks to your principal. Thank you, Reverend Sister. Thank you.
Okay, sir. We will convey, sir.
Please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, dear participants, for your constant support. Kindly do join us tomorrow for the 4th lecture of the webinar series at 6:30 p.m.